Dobro večer iz Sarajevskog studija N1 televizije. Ruska invazija na Ukrajinu ulazi u 428. dan. Ukrajinska vojska nastavlja pružati otpor na istoku, jugoistoku i na jugu. Prva 24 sata dugo očekivane protuofanzive Ukrajine mogla bi biti najduži dan za ukrajinske oružane snage od početka ovog rata. Večeras razgovaramo s ljudima s prve linije odbrane ukrajinske vojske, sada već zapadom potpomognute vojne sile. Ekskluzivni gosti specijalne emisije o ratu u Ukrajini su nekadašnja američka novinarka, danas vojnik u oružanim snagama Ukrajine, Ashton-Cirillo. S nama iz Kijeva je CNN-ov Nic Robertson. Analiziramo zločine počinjene nad civilnim stanovništvom, govorimo o sankcijama Zapada prema Rusiji, ali i prijetnjama nuklearnim ratom. O humanitarnoj situaciji i konektivitetu za N1 govori i ukrajinski volonter Vladyslav Stadnyk. Ostanite uz nas. Na istoku Ukrajine 10. mjesec vodi se bitka oko Bahmuta. Osnivač paravojne grupe Wagner, Jevgenij Prigožin, očekuje početak ukrajinske kontraofanzive poslije 1. ili 2. maja, kada se, kako kaže, poboljšaju vremenski uslovi. Osnivač Wagner grupe kaže da njegove trupe pojačavaju napade pred neizbježnu ukrajinsku kontraofanzivu. Generalštab ukrajinske vojske je na Facebooku saopćio da se nastavljaju teške borbe za Bahmut i okolna područja, kao i da ruske snage nisu uspjele da osvoje 2 sela na sjeverozapadu. Navode da je 10-ak naselja dospjelo pod rusku vatru. Broj povrijeđenih u noćašnjem ruskom napadu na Mikolajev povećao se na 23, uključujući jedno dijete, a jedna osoba je poginula. Ukrajinski predsjednik Volodimir Zelenski objavio je snimak na kojem se vidi šteta koju je tokom noći nanio ruski napad na Mikolajev. Zelenski je napisao da Rusija ne prestaje da dokazuje da je glavni cilj rata teror i uništenje Ukrajinaca i svega ukrajinskog.
Поехали, отдыхали, ничего не сделали. Слушай, все на эту стройку. И пришел этот гнусный мир. Русский, чтобы он сдох. Где они взяли на нашу голову. И нас оставили ни с чем. Тут погиб невестка моей сын. Саша.
А вы где были вообще, когда это все произошло?
Тут в зале спала, только туда дальше. Окна же эти пластиковые повылетали. Вообще аж. Я сколько было, я не могла найти ни вдіться, ні взуться, все там в хаті привалило. Ти хоч вже, коли розрішайте, хоч документи забрати, там денежку знайти, тут лікарства всі там.
Generalni sekretar NATO saveza Jens Stoltenberg saopćio je da su članice i partneri Vojnog saveza do sada isporučili Ukrajini 230 tenkova. Obučili su i opremili više od 9 novih ukrajinskih oklopnih brigada od nekoliko hiljada vojnika. To, kaže, stavlja Ukrajinu u snažnu poziciju za nastavak preuzimanja kontrole nad okupiranim teritorijama.
Overall, through the contact group led by the United States, NATO allies and partners have provided unprecedented support to Ukraine. More than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered. That means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition.
All right, Nic Robertson is joining us from the capital of Ukraine. Nic, welcome back on N1. Newest development. Zelensky speaks to Xi Jinping for the first time since the war started. What is being discussed? What do we know? And how is this new development perceived in Ukraine?
It's being seen as a good diplomatic overture and a good sort of restart to a conversation between two very important trade partners. But it comes sort of at the time when President Xi and his peace proposal for Ukraine, following his visit to President Putin in Moscow a month ago, at least to Ukraine's allies, feels very pro-Russian. That President Xi didn't ever mention that Russia had illegally invaded Ukraine. And of course, President Zelensky's view about a peace plan for Ukraine is that Russia removes all its troops from the country back to pre-1991 borders. But the leaders here have agreed to have a diplomatic exchange. A Chinese envoy will come to Ukraine and other countries in the region for political consultations, and Ukraine will send an ambassador to Beijing. So it's an important step in this conversation that Ukraine has been trying to restart with China as President Xi tries to sort of position himself as a potential negotiator, potential somebody who can bring peace to the war in Ukraine. And I think there's a sense in Ukraine that really, for that to have any currency, any meaningful currency, China really needs to understand Ukraine's position better and kind of move itself from what's seen as a very pro-Russian position. But at the moment, this is seen as a positive diplomatic overture.
The city of Bakhmut, I want to take you to the eastern Ukraine. So the city of Bakhmut has been battered by heavy fighting for months now. Now, the struggle comes at considerable cost of manpower, resources to both Ukrainian and Russian forces. Now, Nick, why are we seeing that this city is important for Ukrainian defense?
Well, I think there are several reasons. One of them is that Russia has set its targets on Bakhmut, and Ukraine says it won't give up any of its territory. And Russia set its targets there because President Putin has said that he wants to take the whole of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which would include Bakhmut. If Ukraine pulls out of Bakhmut, then what it does is allow Russia potentially to rush forward to the next Ukrainian cities, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and these are cities that have tens of thousands of people until recently living in them. So there's that part of it as well. If you give up Bakhmut, if you pull your troops out of this very intense battle in Bakhmut, then you're essentially giving Russia more and easy territory. And I think there's another part of it as well, because the Ukrainians feel that in Bakhmut, although the fighting is intense and they have a high number of casualties, they also are inflicting a very high number, a higher number of casualties on the Russian forces. And this is a way, in essence, to blunt Russia's forces ahead of what could be a potential offensive coming up over the next month or couple of months.
Let's take now the step forward. The expected counteroffensive of Ukraine would not just involve a few operations, as we know, but rather a large effort towards the strategic goal of liberating the entire Ukrainian territory from Russian occupation. Now, what do we know about this now?
Very few hard details, it has to be known. We don't know when it will begin. Will it be in a few weeks or will it be in another month or so? That isn't clear. Where will it be? That isn't known, although it's believed that Ukraine is trying to find weaknesses in Russia's defense. Ukraine believes that Russia has hundreds of thousands of Russian troops now on its territory in Ukraine, so that's a lot of troops. Ukraine knows that it needs to have quick success in this offensive. It needs to be able to push forward quickly and have early success to create a dynamic of a rapid advancement. And that isn't really possible at the moment because there's been a lot of rain over the past weeks, and that has left many of the access roads and many of the sort of key terrain where you'd want to move heavy fighting vehicles through quickly. It's left them very muddy, very bogged down, and therefore there's the potential for an offensive to stall. And also there's a sense, and again, one doesn't get this officially from Ukrainians, but they still don't have quite everything that they would like to have. They would like to have more ammunition, more artillery shells, so that they can keep up the pressure of the offensive once it begins to move forward. And as well, you know, although they've brought in modern battle tanks from allies and partners across Europe and Canada and eventually the United States as well, these are not going to be the make or break in the fight. They're important, but another important component to them is having the field repair capability for this heavy military equipment. So I think all of these, delayed potentially by the weather, delayed potentially because supplies aren't quite ready, where and when isn't clear, and it's such a massive task to try to push Russia out of Ukrainian territory in its entirety. I think most strategists here at least don't believe that can all be done in one summer.
One summer. We spoken to each other in January, just before 2020, last year, just before invasion started. And you've been in Moscow till the very last moment, Nick, till the very last foreign journalist was allowed to stay. You were there now. You're back in Kyiv. What is being discussed? What do reports say? What do people say? How might this war end eventually? Will it? When? What is being discussed generally among population?
You know, I think both sides are hardened to the conflict. Certainly this, you know, talking to people on the streets in Moscow before the conflict began, people were talking about a brotherly relationship with Ukraine. They couldn't believe that President Putin would force them to go and fight Ukrainians. Many mixed marriages between Russians and Ukrainians. Many people felt that the two nations were Slavic brothers, that they were kith and kin, that they wouldn't go to war. But I think the war has brought polarization and a hardening on both sides. Certainly Ukrainians, the majority, feel a massive anger towards Russia. And I think on the Russian street, President Putin's narrative has become more powerful, more persuasive, more pervasive, if you will, simply because President Putin has crushed all opposition media almost in its entirety, which means that Russians only really hear, for the majority of the population, only really hear the government narrative. So I think the sides are apart. But there is a recognition, ultimately, that all wars end in peace talks of some description. But I think the sense you get at the moment is, beyond any shadow of a doubt, there is a lot more fighting to happen, certainly this year, potentially next year, and even if you get a peace deal, I think at the moment there's little trust on either side that that would hold and you wouldn't go back to war again in the future.
If I may ask a personal question, now you're mentioning that, of course, you've been in Moscow, you've been all over Ukraine, and you're mentioning Slavic brothers, mixed marriages. You've been in Bosnia in the 90s. Does this now in Ukraine remind you of what happened in Bosnia and the people being interconnected, and now all of this happening in the way that it's happening, that we're seeing it unfold before our eyes? Does it remind you of the 90s when you were here in Sarajevo?
It does, in some ways, yes. And I think, you know, it reminds me, but it frightens me a bit, because we can all look back about what happened in the 90s and see the lessons that have been learned and what it does to a country and what it does to people's relationships. You know, within the country. And I think, you know, if you look ahead now about these deep divisions that are created between Ukrainian and Russian, you can see that these are wounds that are not going to heal easily or quickly. And I see that being a deep difficulty ahead. And that if you look at the solutions that were applied in Bosnia in the 90s, like the Dayton Peace Accords, for example, and have recently been in Northern Ireland, and we've been talking about the 25-year-old Northern Ireland Peace Agreement as well, and how many people in Northern Ireland and many people in Bosnia think that these agreements need to be updated. So if you look at whatever peace might be achieved theoretically in the future between Ukraine and Russia, you really begin to understand that it's going to need to be a dynamic peace as well, that will need to be allowed to shift with with time, but that deep enmity that's created by war, by losing family members, by feeling that you have to fight, you have to choose sides, there's no alternative. Yes, this is very divisive, and it makes great difficulties going forward.
Nick, thank you very much. This was CNN's Nic Robertson from Kyiv. Coming up next, we are going to first lines of Ukrainian defense. Stay with us. Američka novinarka, danas vojnik na strani ukrajinskih snaga, Sarah Ashton-Cirillo iz Ukrajine. S terena nam se javlja. Sarah, welcome to N1 and thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you online and to visit your channel. N1 has been instrumental in helping us get our message out of truth and what's behind the reasons that we're fighting this war for liberty and liberation. So thank you all viewers of N1 as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are here for you. Sarah, first of all, I would like to ask you, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Last time we spoke, I was at what I call the position, that's the zero line. Today, you're speaking to me from the Kharkiv Media Hub, which is an instrumental location in trying to push the pillars of free speech and free press, which is one of the reasons we're fighting against the tyrant fascists in Russia.
And when we are talking about free speech, we see in Russia so many things happening at the moment. Journalists being incarcerated, being convicted to 25 years for free speech. So free speech is something that is fundamental to all of us. And this is what we are also defending, what you are defending in Ukraine as well. All right, let's take you completely way back from the beginning, when you first arrived. And of course, and when you first arrived to Ukraine, what was your intent? What was it to stay? What were your first impressions? I recollect that you arrived to the country on March 4th and with a return plane ticket on March 21. So how did it happen? Just take us from the beginning.
We were talking about journalists. Currently, I'm a junior sergeant in the Armed Forces of Ukraine. However, when I arrived, I was a journalist covering the humanitarian crisis, specifically the situation with refugees. And during this battle for liberty and liberation, we went ahead and a lot has taken place over the last 14 months, both for the country, for the world, and for myself personally. When I came, I was only coming for a couple of weeks, as you mentioned, specifically to cover those who were fleeing the war crimes and the terror inflicted upon Ukrainians from the Russian Federation. This included displaced people internally, as well as external refugees in Europe. And I had covered the last European migration crisis, the one that focused on Syrians, Iraqis, and Afghanistanis in 2015 and 2016. And prior to that, the last great refugee crisis in Europe was one that your viewers are very familiar with. That was Bosnians who were escaping the genocide that was being inflicted by the Russian allies in Serbia on them. And so this was always a key component to what I wanted to cover and tell the world about. And as I undertook my stories here, I realized there was something much greater at hand. We were on the precipice of what we have to consider a global war. In some ways, we are on the verge of the greatest war size-wise since World War II, and I knew more had to be done, so I decided to stay.
And you have stayed. We have so much more to discuss. I hope we get it in time. I want to talk about the moment when you were injured in Donbas region. Before we continue discussing that, let's watch it.
Sarah, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine, sir. You know what? They can't kill us. They can't hurt us. Victory is ours. It doesn't fucking matter. Why? Because we're Ukraine. And ultimately, Putin is going to be the one dead. Prigozhin is going to be the one dead. And this is a small price for liberation and for freedom. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава! Героям слава!
So good to see you well today, Sarah. Tell me about that moment. Tell me how it happened. Tell me what was going through your mind. And tell me about healing those injuries.
Spilling blood for Ukraine is a small price to pay for freedom and liberty. Let me reiterate that. Let me also reiterate the message that the Russians can't kill us. Every attack on us, every war crime inflicted upon the Ukrainian people, and every bit of terrorism that rains down from the skies only makes the Ukrainian people stronger and makes those of us in ZSU, the armed forces of Ukraine, more resolute in defeating Putin, Prigozhin, and all the war criminals that are carrying out this war against freedom. I'm healing well. I was in the hospital for 16 days. It took 7 hours to evacuate me because the fighting was so fierce. However, we won that battle. And after 16 days in the hospital, I was able to return to my unit and return to the front. When that video was made, it wasn't made for any reason but to check and make sure I wasn't suffering from a concussion. And clearly I wasn't, because the words I spoke that day and in that video resonated with viewers around the world when it was released on social media. The war became very personal for me in that moment. I had been literally attacked by the Russian enemy. And I knew in that moment, when I realized that they attempted to kill me, they attempt to kill my brothers and sisters in arms, that as long as we're breathing, we're winning. Ukraine has already won.
We'll go to social media and to those who try to minimize every Ukrainian soldier, every person that is fighting on Ukrainian side. But you have often been on Russian television as a subject, as a topic. I've seen it so many times. They try to pick on you. They try to make you a target. Does it concern you? Are you worried that being so exposed in the Russian media as someone who is anti-Russia, who is an enemy, that somebody might even come and look for you?
They threaten me. They try to geolocate me. My commanders have told me they're literally hunting me down. But this is what I know. Every time they speak of me, every time they attempt their ridiculous propaganda aimed at me and others here in this battle against them, they're just adding more time to their convictions and more time to what they're going to be facing when we have them on trial in the International Criminal Court. Every propagandist that's carrying out the wishes of Vladimir Putin and his war criminals are also war criminals. I don't mind being the subject of their hate, because the reality is Russia hates the truth, which means when they're attacking me, they're attacking the truth.
And what would you say to Russian citizens, for people who will probably watch this too, who are doubting everything that has been going on, the so-called special operation in Ukraine? What would your message to be to an ordinary citizen in Russia, somebody who should be hearing this, what we are discussing today, and hearing the facts from the very battlefield?
When you listen to somebody like Skabieva, when you listen to the mouthpieces of the Russian Federation, you're hearing lies. When you're watching N1, when you're watching CNN, you're able to hear the truth. So to any Russians who are understanding what the facts are on the ground, I call on them to stand up, to make their voices heard, and to not be afraid. Ukraine and the world have the backs of freedom-loving Russians everywhere. Don't be fearful. Take the chains of slavery off that Vladimir Putin has subjected you to. Break them and stand up for the freedom that you know is burning in your soul. Don't be silent. Don't be complicit. And let the world understand that the members of the Russian Federation who are carrying out this terror and war crimes against the people of Ukraine don't speak for you.
Thank you, Sarah. Documents leaked documents show that Ukraine could start a full-scale counterattack on Russian army very soon on April 30th, full loaded with Western military equipment as well. Will you be, and your unit, taking part in this?
I don't know anything about, quote, counterattacks. What I do know about my unit is we've fought the Russians many times, and we've won every battle. We've been fighting for 14 months, my unit, I've been fighting for several months myself now at the front. If and when a, quote, counteroffensive, counterattack comes, wonderful. What I know is that every day we're inflicting tremendous damage and casualties on the Russian terrorists and war criminals.
Sarah, let's talk about social media. You're very active on social media. Love it. We can see exactly what's been going on the front lines. You're very outspoken, fearless. What do you say to those who try to minimize you? I'm one of them too. I'm getting minimized, try to get minimized all the time, but you definitely. What do you want to say to those who minimize you, who are trying to also pick on you, your gender, your participation? I read a comment just a couple of days ago when it said, hey, but how come your uniform is always clean? Is she really there? What is she doing? What would you say to those who are, as it seems, their only job is to pick on Sarah Ashton-Cirillo?
They do this because of their pathetic lives themselves. I'm wearing a clean shirt right now, proudly wearing my sergeant stripes. The reason? Because although we live without electricity, although we live without running water, we're not animals. Here in Ukraine, we understand what it is to keep ourselves strong, to keep ourselves healthy, keep ourselves looking good. This is not a movie. This is not a video game. We are fighting for our lives, fighting for freedom and liberty every day. So while they're focused on attacks, talking about clothes and appearance, I presume they're just wanting to look at me and try to figure out reasons why they shouldn't be attracted to me. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how we look. It matters the damage we're inflicting upon the Russian Federation and upon the war criminals and terrorists carrying out this war against Ukraine. And that's what folks should listen to, those facts of what's coming from the trenches and what's coming from all of our units that are pushing the Russians back further every day. Bakhmut holds, and Ukraine is free.
The ultimate goal is always the most important, of course. Sarah, I'm always very surprised, always very pleased to see how much you know about our region, the Western Balkans, and what happened in the 90s. And very often in the media, especially in Western media, we're always talking about a conflict that is the most bloody conflict after World War II, but then somehow they overlook and oversee what happened in Bosnia, the genocide, the longest siege of a city in modern history. But I love it how much you understand the history, the recent history and the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, of Serbia, Croatia, and the entire Western Balkans as former Yugoslavia. And how do you draw a parallel, a line between what is going on in Ukraine and what happened in the 90s in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Tell us something more about that.
Let's take a step further back than what we're compared to. People say this war that we're fighting for freedom and liberty against the Russian Federation is similar to World War I or World War II. What happened in Bosnia, that siege, was something that happened out of the Middle Ages. What went on there, the starvation, the death, the deprivation. You and I have a mutual friend in common who grew up in a refugee camp. Something that's less known is that one of my brothers who fell in battle, he would wear the Bosnian flag into battle as a Ukrainian because he would say, only the Bosnians understand what we're fighting for, and I'm taking inspiration from them. He's an eternal hero. Just like the Bosnians who fell in the 1990s are all eternal heroes and who are lighting the fire of victory inside of all of us. The world needs to pause and understand its history so the terms never again or never more truly mean never again and never more. That starts with the Holocaust, but it very much includes all those who fell in Sniper Alley, and it very much includes all those who died during the siege and all the children who grew up in refugee camps in Bosnia. The scars of that time are never going to be forgotten, especially in the hearts of our soldiers and myself as a frontline soldier, who are making certain the Russian Federation and their allies, the Serbs, will not be able to inflict this type of terror and these war crimes upon innocent people ever again. I never want anyone to suffer, but the suffering of the Bosnian people was not in vain.
Thank you. Thank you for that. What do you think drives somebody to commit such crimes? Crimes like in Srebrenica, genocide, crimes like crimes in Bucha, in Mariupol. What would drive a human being to do that to another human being?
I was in Izum when more than 400 bodies were being exhumed. I saw victims of terror who were in states of mummification, whose bodies were liquefied to forms that would be unimaginable. And every day that I left there, I asked myself that question. What causes people to do such terror to other humans? And then I understood. It's not within the human being to do it. These people can only be classified as animals. And because of that, we can't ever get inside the minds of animals. We just have to make sure we never lose our humanity in the face of their attempts to tear humanity down.
Sarah, there are a lot of people whom we speak to always ask, how long is it going to take till Ukraine is either liberated or until there's a peace agreement, until everything, all of this is over and done? Because when it started, when Russia invaded Ukraine last year in February, everybody thought it would only last for a couple of weeks. And here we are, a year and a couple of months in. What is the morale among your men, among people that are on the front line, among Ukrainians? And what is the timeline in everybody's head as how long this is going to take?
I have an exclusive for you right now. I'm going to give you the timeline. It could be tomorrow. President Zelensky has laid out his peace plan, 10 points that are easy to follow. And it begins with the restoration of the 1991 borders that Ukraine established and has fought multiple revolutions in the name of democracy for. The longer answer, as long as the Russian Federation wants to continue to suffer and lose and be beaten by the armed forces of Ukraine, until they wake up and realize that Ukraine has already won, we'll continue to fight. We don't judge it in days, weeks, or months. If our allies were able to get us all the military equipment we needed tomorrow, the war could be over in a week. Until that happens, we'll continue fighting. There's been no drop in morale. There's been no drop in the spirit of any of the soldiers that I serve with or any other units I've heard from. And most specifically, Ukraine, which is constitutionally empowered by its citizens, are continuing to back this war for liberty and liberation. And as long as the people of Ukraine want the armed forces of Ukraine to fight on their behalf to free their nation, we'll continue to do so.
I want to take you back to the beginning of our conversation when you decided to stay in Ukraine. I want to talk about your family, Sarah. What was their reaction to it? What did they tell you? How did they think? What did they think of you staying in Ukraine in midst of war? How did that conversation take part? How did that conversation happen between you and your family?
It was multiple stages. They understood me coming over here. I had a history of covering the refugee crisis, as we had talked about. When I decided to stay longer, they were a little bit surprised. When I decided to stay past the coverage of our elections during what we call the primary season in the U.S. political vernacular, they wondered what was going on. They questioned why I was still staying. By the time I joined the armed forces of Ukraine, the questions had stopped. The war may not be in their backyard, but they support me fighting for freedom, and they understand this is a global war for freedom over fascism, tyranny, and neo-Marxism.
What is the most that you need, you and your teammates, when you are on the front lines? What is it that you need?
You know from having spoken to me the last time just how close to the enemy we are. What we need to win is simple. We need heavy armor. We need as many tanks as the Allies can get us. We need fighter jets, even if they're interceptors. But we also need the basics. Give us more artillery. Give us armored ambulances. Every life saved is a life closer to victory. And due to this fact, we can use more of everything. The faster we get these items, the sooner we win. The less aid has to go into military weapons then, and the more we can look towards rebuilding. And so ultimately, we can win with just our rifles and some ammunition. We want everything, and we want it now. Either way, the sooner we can get the aid that's been requested from Kyiv to our allies across the world, the sooner we can declare victory and look towards rebuilding a more prosperous Ukraine and a Ukraine that's a freedom and a symbol of freedom for nations everywhere.
Do you think there's a reason behind why it takes so much time for the game-changing military equipment is coming to Ukraine? Is there a reason for that? What is being discussed among you on front lines?
Here on the front lines, we see the battles every day. Our leadership in Kyiv and across Ukraine understands this. The further you get from the front, the less urgency there is. This is the largest land war since World War II. We talked about history at the beginning of the segment. People are talking about it in theoretical terms in different capitals around the world. My message to them is, push the theory aside. The reality is, the sooner we get the weapons, the faster we win. Trust what we're saying from Kyiv, trust the generals you're speaking to, trust our civilian leadership led by President Zelensky. Listen to what they're saying. They know what's happening on the front. Again, we're winning with rifles and ammunition, but listen to their counterparts in Kyiv and get us the weapons and put theory aside. That's the number one issue. Come visit for yourself. We will make sure they're secure. We will make sure they're protected. I invite every politician from around the world to contact Kyiv and come visit.
This is probably one of the biggest differences between Bosnian war and Ukrainian war. Just taken in consideration, and this is a good thing, the world is listening to you, the world is watching you, the international community is taking steps in order to help Ukraine fight for Western democracy, for Western values. So it's on you guys now. It's up to you to defend us. When we go back to the 90s, can you imagine that in a full-scale aggression, there was an embargo on arms on Bosnians, on Bosnia and Herzegovina, and can you just imagine something like that happening in Ukraine now, that the world is looking at you being attacked, the children being slaughtered, genocide being committed, children being targeted with snipers, and they say no arms for you. I mean, can you just perceive something like that happening anywhere else for somebody who's fighting for their lives and fighting for the democracy?
This is another reason that I mentioned it's going even past what we're being compared to with World War I. Bosnians were being slaughtered. That's the term. Wholesale genocide against the Bosnian people. A lot of times, fighting back with only their hands. This is why the Bosnians are such inspirations to us. Because even in our darkest hour, when the tyrant Putin was predicting a three-day capitulation by Ukraine, we still had the heavy weapons necessary to stop their incursion and stop their full-scale invasion of us. The Bosnians were hampered not only by an enemy, but hampered by the inaction of the global community. And again, to anybody watching this, look into the history books. You don't have to go back to World War II. That's just a starting point. Go back to 1991, go back to 1992. Don't allow wholesale slaughter of civilians to ever take place again, like it happened in Bosnia. We just had more than a dozen civilians killed in the Donbass recently in a terror attack, missiles that hit an apartment building. We know what takes place when animals are trying to carry out genocide of human beings. 30 years ago is not an eternity. Understand the lessons of Bosnia and get us our weapons now. Save lives and rekindle the torch of freedom in Europe.
And because of the all unresolved issues from the past, from 30 years ago, there are still pretty heavy war rhetorics, secessionist rhetorics in Bosnia. What do you think when it comes to Ukraine, after everything that has happened? If we look back on Kyiv, on Bucha, you mentioned Donbass, Mariupol, remember the theater where it was written right in front, children, deti. It was shelled. Will there ever be a chance? I mean, I even think this is quite a stupid question, but I'm asking it because Bosnians were forced in that state of mind. Do you think there'll ever be any possibility for reconciliation with Russia after what they've done? And
That's up to the Russian people.
I'm very sorry for this question, but if we are seeing history repeating itself, it is very much likely that there will be conversation. There will be conversation about that in the future. What do you think,
I'm glad
Sarah?
you asked the question. We're fighting for the free press. We're fighting for journalism to ask questions that need to be asked. And there's no tough questions. There's only questions that are painful, and this is one of them. To answer the first part, it's up to the Russian people. The Russian Federation has been engaged in colonialism and has been engaged in terrorism and has been engaged in cultural genocide of their people and neighbors for hundreds of years. It's up to the Russian people themselves to make certain that this never happens again. There will have to be a reconciliation. And if there's not, the good news is a victorious Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine has already won. A victorious Ukraine returned to its 1991 borders will ensure that the Russian Federation will no longer be able to terrorize its neighbors, NATO, or be able to give support to regimes such as what the Serbians did to the Bosnians ever again. What we want is for the Russian people to break the chains of slavery and stand up for freedom. What we're prepared for is for Ukraine to be defenders of democracy, liberty, and all that is right with humanity moving forward if the Russian Federation does not learn its lessons during this war.
And thank you. Thank you for this. Sometimes I struggle with that thought, reconciliation. But again, like I said, the history has taught us that there has to be a conversation, no matter what happened. Hopefully, even if in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in our region, we still sometimes, from time to time, we fear the worst. We still rely on common sense somehow. And I'm really hoping that Ukrainians will keep their heart intact. Will you stay in Ukraine after everything is over? Or what are you planning to do? Have you ever thought about what is in store for you after everything is over and done? I can't imagine you going back to the United States. You're practically Ukrainian.
My answer is simple. The Ukraine that is being fought for here is a Ukraine that immigrants everywhere would probably want to come to and realize is a land of freedom and realize is a land of opportunity. As for me, my focus is always on the next sunrise and the next sunset, day by day, battle by battle. Once we've achieved President Zelensky's peace plan, and specifically the return to the 1991 borders, then I'll start to think about my future in the long term. Until then, I'm just thinking about what tomorrow brings, what today was, and the transformative defeat of the Russian Federation at the hands of the armed forces of Ukraine.
You need to stay alive, Sarah, for to be able to tell your story, to tell the story of your men to the world. You have been that channel for all of us journalists, for all of us public, to see, piece of that feeling, the battle on the front lines, and you bled for Ukraine. You need to stay healthy and you need to stay alive for all of us, for all of your men, all of your Ukrainians. And I just want to send you a lot of love from all of us here and from Bosnians who are very fond of you as well. Is there anything you want to add to our audiences as well for the end, or have your say?
I'm grateful for all those watching this in Croatia, in Bosnia, for those who are seeing this in Serbia as well, who understand that freedom matters. I'm grateful for you as a journalist and all of my former colleagues and your current colleagues who are standing up for what true freedom means. And speaking of freedom, the Russian Federation needs to free Evan from the Wall Street Journal and every other person being held as prisoners in their sick game of chess against the civilized world.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bila je ovo Sarah Ashton-Cirillo koja nam se javila iz Harkiva. Govorili smo o raznim temama. Ostanite svakako uz nas. U Ukrajini rastu špekulacije o vremenu kritične kontraofanzive protiv ruskih snaga. Nick Walsh javlja se upravo sa južnog fronta.
Change is in the air, but here in Vuhledar, Russia is the same in its intensity and clumsiness of bombing. It's not clear if this tiny town is a launch pad for Ukraine's counter-offensive, but Moscow pounds it just to be sure. A similar story here too, on a riverbank near Kherson, that reportedly Ukrainian forces may be crossing into occupied areas. Their officials claiming, quote, impressive results on Tuesday. A Russian airstrike hit, even though it's unclear what they struck. Ukraine's otherwise kept quiet about its big assault, despite some opaque social media videos suggesting movement. Russian troops are, according to one Ukrainian official from the occupied town of Melitopol, definitely on the move.
So now we see that they relocated. So they make two great big bases for Russian troops. All of these bases located on the seaside of Azov Sea, more than 100 kilometers from the front line.
He joked about how common accidents are there for Russians, one overturning this launcher, especially on the railway, vital for military supplies.
Maybe 3 weeks, there is no electricity on the railway, and they use old diesel trains. And a few days ago, something happened with diesel trains, and it was a great fire, and now there is no this diesel.
When you say something happened, you mean there was an explosion, and you know something about that?
Something happened.
We spoke to one local man who fled the city 4 days ago.
Proper Russian troops aren't there yet. It's just the newly mobilized who would not fight if they weren't threatened by being shot for ill discipline. Everyone local suspects everyone else of something. Even people who you would drink vodka with, you can't talk to now.
Still, Moscow keeps up with what it calls evacuations. This another episode of Ukrainian children being sent to what Russia calls safety. Here, 43 from an area right in the path of the counter-offensive, packed off to Moscow's ally Belarus for a 2-week break. Others in the past were offered a similar trip, but held for months. Ukraine has said 20,000 have been deported already, and it's led to a war crimes indictment against Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's unclear what comes next for them and the town in the crosshairs they leave behind. Nick Payton-Walsh, CNN, Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine.
Vladyslav Stadnyk je ukrajinski volonter. Nakon puta oko svijeta vratio se 2014. godine nakon ruske aneksije Krima. Odlučio je da ostane u svojoj zemlji kako bi se posvetio onima kojima pomoć zaista sada i treba. A Vladyslav je s nama upravo iz Kijeva. Vladyslav, welcome to N1. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. You've been volunteering for the past 8 years, gathering a couple of your friends and getting supplies across to the front lines. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, when the Maidan revolution ended, I was not one of those people who went on the front lines. And since it's everyone's war, right? We all had to do our part, and we all still have to do our part every day, you know, to bring our victory closer. Me and a couple of my friends, we had a little volunteer group, and we started gathering supplies. At first, it was as simple as the uniform, believe it or not. But in 2014, Ukrainian army did not have, you know, sufficient amount of uniform and just basic supplies, and that's what we've been getting onto the front lines in the first year, you know, after Russia annexed Crimea. And then after that, of course, you know, we went on to, you know, simple stuff like binoculars and stuff like that. And we've been doing that in and out for the past 8 years until the big war started, until the, you know, the 24th of February last year, when the full-scale invasion by Russia started. And that's basically what took off, unfortunately, to an absolutely new level, just because of the sheer size of everything that's going on and everything that is needed there.
And Vladyslav, in our private conversation as well, you explained to me you have traveled the world and came back to Ukraine, and you said, hey, this is my home, this is where I'm supposed to be, especially now when the times are difficult, when times are hard. Tell us where you've been and what was the exact thought when you decided to go back to Ukraine?
Well, I've lived, as you said, in a bunch of countries, and I actually met a lot of Bosnian friends who are amazing people, and I'm very happy to be here today. But I've lived in Costa Rica. I went to international school there. After that, I went to study in Boston, in Massachusetts, in London, came back to Boston, lived and worked there, and, you know, a bunch of other countries as well. So, and then I was getting ready. I had a contract up in the US, and I was getting ready, you know, to go to Costa Rica once again, and came back to Ukraine for what I thought was several months. But then the revolution started, the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity. And, you know, on the first day, basically, of revolution, when it started for me, I realized that I don't want to go anywhere. This is where I want to, you know, be, and this is where I have to be, around around home, exactly.
Home. Yeah. That word home is so, it hits deep, it hits really hard, especially for those who have been away from home for so many years, for such a long time. You started this June official nonprofit organization, Steel Wings Foundation. What are the most needs at this point, and how does this operate? How do you do it on the ground?
The needs are very, very different. That's why every volunteer group, every nonprofit kind of specializes in, you know, in special things. We've decided that we're specializing in drones and protective equipment and thermal visioners. So basically everything that can save lives of either civilians or our boys and girls on the front lines, you know, in order for them to identify a potential threat right away and see where the enemy is. So that's what we've been doing since June, quite a lot. And the whole idea is that when it comes to drones, there's so many specifics, and I never thought that I would, but I became kind of a drone expert, you know, in the past year or so. But basically what we do is we try to find the drones we need all across Europe and beyond Europe, I'll be honest with you, raise funds on a constant basis. I have a heavy metal blog. I have some people in Ukraine who trust me, and people from outside of Ukraine who trust me as well, who donate funds to the foundation. And then we basically scout the world for the drones we need, for the thermal visioners we need, and so on and so forth, and bring them into Ukraine and then distribute it directly to the front lines or through some, army units and stuff like that. So that's what we've been doing for so long already, and we do not intend to stop until our full victory.
And before I let you go, Vladyslav, I would really love to know, and our audience would love to know, what is a day like in Kyiv today? What is it like today? I understood last night you had the opportunity to see a ballet. We're talking about heavy metal, but you also go see a ballet. So tell us a little bit about the sense of normalcy for the Ukrainians in these very difficult times.
One thing you need to understand, and I think you understand, Bosnians understand this very, very well, that in order to keep yourself sane, you need to find the moments of normality within all this chaos. Just because your head most likely will not be able to survive this. And that's why, despite anything, some places in Ukraine, the ones that are able to do so, try to live normal life as much as it is possible. So last night, me and my wife, for the first time since, forever, it feels like, we left our kids with a grandma for 2 hours and we went to see a Kyiv Modern Ballet, which was amazing. And this was just a breath of fresh air for us amidst everything that is going on. And, it was a wonderful feeling, but unfortunately this morning we woke up to the news of a deadly attack by Russians on Mykolaiv, where so many civilians again were injured or died. And unfortunately, you realize that those even slight, small moments of peaceful and normal life, come at a very, very high cost. And that's why, that was a little break that we had, because everyone needs to relax once in a while. And now we're on back to our volunteer work and doing everything we can to bring our victory closer.
So you can imagine how much that 1 hour, 1.5 hours mean to somebody who wakes up to the news like that. We do understand that. Vladyslav, I want to thank you for your time and for speaking to N1, telling us what you do on the ground. And of course, we keep in touch.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladyslav. Gledali ste N1 specijalnu emisiju o Ukrajini. Naši ekskluzivni gosti bili su nekadašnja američka novinarka, danas vojnik u oružanim snagama Ukrajine, Ashton-Cirillo. S nama iz Kijeva bio je i CNN-ov Nic Robertson. Analizirali smo i zločine počinjene nad civilnim stanovništvom, govorili o sankcijama Zapada prema Rusiji, ali i prijetnjama nuklearnim ratom. O humanitarnoj situaciji i konektivitetu za N1 govorio je i ukrajinski volonter Vladyslav Stadnyk. Ovu emisiju možete i potražiti na našem sajtu n1info.com. Izaberite državu: Bosna i Hercegovina, Srbija, Hrvatska ili Slovenija. Ja sam Ika Ferer-Gotić. Hvala za pažnju.